Hey friends, this is the first Sunday in Lent, and I wanted you to know that while I may not be practicing self-denial during Lent, this is my nod to the Middle East with some baklava and tea. Cheers to you. While we talk about what is on my mind this weekend, I want to give a shout out to pastor and author Adam Hamilton, whose book 24 Hours That Changed the World is the study that my men's ministry groups, both on Saturday morning and Wednesday evening, are using as our point of reference for this journey through Lent. And we've had some great conversations already, everything from trying to understand how the Lord's Supper brought the traditions of a Jewish Seder meal and the identity of a defining moment that they found in sharing all those elements, from the bitter herbs to the unleavened bread to the lamb, bringing that into the defining characteristic of Christianity, what Jesus gave us through the Last Supper, saying, this is my body broken for you, and this is my blood spilt for you. And to not just remember, but to participate in all that Jesus is offering, not just as a victory over death, but an introduction into a new kind of life. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the resurrection on Easter. But for today, ideas. Well, let me tell you what we talked about in my Sunday school class. It was quite a while ago, but we were going through some theological and doctrinal concepts, looking at a book called Christian Doctrine by Dr. Shirley Guthrie. And I raised the question, and it was partly rhetorical, partly a real question. Did Jesus have to die? In other words, was Christ's death necessary in order for us to experience salvation, in order for us to gain access to God's love in the way that God intended when we were created? And the reasoning behind my question were things like, well, God can do what God likes. There's no obligation for a blood sacrifice, is there? Even though part of the Jewish tradition involved that sort of work for atonement. And we were debating this kind of from an intellectual point of view, and partly from a point of view of people who were trying to wrap our heads around what it means to be loved unconditionally by God, and how Christ's Last Supper, death and resurrection works to make all that possible. And my friend Marv Baker, he came up with a wonderful observation, and he said, well, all those debates and conversations around, was it doctrinally necessary? Was it theologically necessary? They're all spurious. They're all irrelevant, because Christ's death was inevitable. He said, inevitable. Meaning, of course, that when pure goodness and love comes into a world such as ours, and that's really illustrated dramatically right now with the amount of just obvious and blatant evil and flaunting of evil that we see in the world. If that much goodness comes into the world, of course, he's going to die. Of course, Jesus was going to be executed. Of course, the world could not tolerate such an influx of goodness. And so the question of did Jesus have to die was not really necessary. The question really is, what are we going to do in response to Christ's death and resurrection? Resurrection as the firstborn into a new kind of life. And are we, in the way that we live, going to identify with Jesus to such an extent that our goodness becomes dangerous, but our goodness becomes something which is hard for the world to handle. And then I think we are beginning to touch the implications of what this season means. So as we continue to prepare ourselves to be ready for Easter, to be ready to wave our palm branches on Palm Sunday and to go through the disciplines and the recognitions and the remembrances of Holy Week, and to consider what it means for Jesus to die, let us realize that there can be no resurrection without first crucifixion. There can be no understanding of light if there is not also darkness. That there can be no real appreciation of goodness unless it is set against the fact of evil. And Jesus brings us into goodness. Jesus brings us into light. Jesus brings us into resurrection. So as we enter the first Sunday of the season of Lent, I want us to give good thought to what Jesus has made possible in us. As he said, I go so that you can even do greater things collectively than me. So that's my prayer. I'm Derek Maul. I'm participating in this journey with you. And God bless you this weekend.